The dispatcher picked up on the first ring and said, 911, what's your emergency? And Marianne Keller answered in a whisper, please, stay on the line. And the dispatcher asked her where she was, and Marianne said, my house. He's inside. And when the dispatcher asked who he was, a low voice appeared so close to the receiver, it sounded like it was breathing into it, and it said, don't say her name. And Marianne sucked in a breath like she'd been caught, and she tried to speak again. If I say the time, he'll... And then the line went dead. The call lasted barely over a minute, and later the official record would insist it never happened. 3 weeks earlier, Marianne was the kind of woman people didn't notice unless they lived on her street. 68, recently widowed, a small tan house outside Phoenix. Trimmed hedges, porch light always on. Her life ran on habits because habits made the evenings feel controlled. Coffee, the same news anchors, the same grocery store, the same game shows she didn't even like, just to keep sound in the rooms after dark. But lately, something had started to change inside her home, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like someone nudging her life 1 inch at a time and waiting to see if she'd fight back. A pill organizer appeared on the bathroom counter that she knew she didn't buy. A printed schedule showed up on her fridge with her name typed in bold, telling her when to take pills she didn't recognize. And then an envelope came from the county with the words, Guardianship Review, stamped across the front like a warning. When Marianne called the number on the letter, the woman who answered spoke to her the way you speak to someone you've already decided is confused, and said, don't worry, honey, it's routine. And that word, routine, didn't calm Marianne at all, because it sounded like paperwork had already started moving without her. The first knock came the next day, a smiling woman in a blazer, mid-30s, polite, professional. Introducing herself as Nora from a senior support service Marianne had never heard of. Nora explained they helped with bills and forms and making things easier. And while she spoke, she kept glancing past Marianne's shoulder into the living room. Not like a visitor, but like someone checking a space she expected to enter. Marianne didn't let her in. But Nora came back the following day with a grocery bag and a printed list of recommended medications from a clinic Marianne had never visited. And then Nora came back again with a handyman to fix Marianne's laundry room window that never latched properly. And every time Marianne tried to push back, Nora didn't argue. She got clinical, opened a tablet, scrolled, and said in that calm voice, it's okay if you don't remember. It happens. And Marianne felt something hot and sharp in her chest because she remembered everything that mattered.
It should be ready now.
She especially remembered what it felt like when strangers began making decisions around her instead of with her. The night of the call, Marianne went to bed early because the house felt wrong, in the way a room feels wrong when an object has been moved a fraction and your brain keeps circling it, trying to prove it's the same as before. She woke to a soft thump from the hallway, then a faint scrape like fabric brushing paint. And she lay still and listened until the silence felt loud. Her cell phone was useless in the back rooms, so she reached for the old landline she kept just in case. And she moved barefoot to her bedroom doorway and stared into the dark hall where a weak nightlight glowed near the bathroom. The laundry room door at the end of the hall was slightly open. Marianne knew she'd closed it. She backed into her bedroom, shut the door as quietly as she could, turned the lock with shaking fingers, and dialed. The dispatcher answered, and Marianne said, someone's in my house. And the dispatcher told her to stay in place, asked if she could see anyone, asked if she had a weapon, and Marianne said, no. I just want them gone. And while the dispatcher spoke in that steady tone, Marianne heard footsteps that were too close, closer than the hallway should allow, like someone was already on the other side of her bedroom door. The dispatcher asked, "Marianne, are you alone in that room?" And Marianne whispered, I don't know." And the dispatcher pressed, "What do you mean you don't know?" And Marianne's voice tightened. "He said he had a key." And when the dispatcher demanded, "Who is he?" Marianne swallowed and said, "The one from the papers. The one who said I signed it." And then the low voice came again, intimate and controlled, and said, "Don't say her name." And the dispatcher snapped, "Sir, identify yourself." And a muffled sound followed, like a hand covering a mouth, followed by Marianne's tiny, breathy words. "If I say the time, he'll..." And then the call dropped. Officers arrived to a house that looked perfectly normal from the outside. Front door locked, back door locked, windows shut, no signs of forced entry. They found Marianne sitting on the edge of her bed, still holding the receiver like it was the last thing keeping her steady, eyes wet, silent crying, the kind that looks practiced. She told them someone had been there. She told them a man had whispered behind her. She told them someone said she'd signed her home away, and the officers exchanged that look people exchange when they don't want to call someone confused out loud. They searched anyway. Nothing. No intruder. No open laundry window. No disturbance. But in the kitchen, centered neatly on the table as if placed for her to find in the morning, was a single paper with a county stamp and her full name at the top. Notice of guardianship hearing. And at the bottom, in a signature that looked exactly like Marianne's, was her name. My name, written as if she had agreed to everything. The next morning, Marianne went to the station and asked for a copy of her 911 call because she needed proof. And the clerk typed, paused, and carefully said, "Ma'am, there's no call logged." And Marianne felt the floor tilt because she knew what she heard and what she said. And the clerk turned his monitor and showed her the only entry, a hang-up call, time-stamped at a different hour. And Marianne stared at it because she knew the exact moment she dialed. She remembered staring at the bedside clock while she whispered for help. And the time in the system wasn't wrong by a minute. It was wrong by an entire hour. And in that instant, Marianne understood something terrifyingly simple. If the record was changed, then the man in her house that night wasn't there to steal jewelry. He was there to steal her reality, one official line at a time. Marianne didn't go home after the station. She sat in her car in the parking lot with both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as if the windshield might suddenly show her the truth. The clerk's words kept repeating in her head. No call logged, only a hang-up. And the worst part wasn't that they didn't believe her. It was that the system had created a version of her night that made her look foolish. If there was only a hang-up, then Marianne was just another confused older woman who dialed by mistake. If the timestamp was wrong, then Marianne was just someone who couldn't remember when anything happened. That was the point, she realized. It wasn't only about an intruder. It was about taking away the only thing that mattered when you're trying to fight back: credibility. She drove home slowly, checking her mirrors too often, flinching at every headlight that followed a little too long. The house looked the same as always from the street. Tan stucco, small porch, a porch light that somehow made the shadows feel worse. Marianne sat in the driveway for a minute before she got out. And when she finally stepped onto the porch, she noticed something small that made her stomach tighten. The new doormat was different. She was sure it had been plain brown. Now it had a cheerful pattern and the word "welcome" in bright letters. Like someone was decorating a house they planned to keep. She didn't step on it. She reached for the key hidden under the flower pot and felt her hand go cold because the pot was in the wrong place. Not knocked over. Placed differently, neatly, like a deliberate change. She opened the door and went inside without turning on any lights. The air smelled faintly like lavender, but she didn't use lavender. In the kitchen, the paper from the county was still centered on her table. She picked it up carefully, like it might bite. The words were official, full of polite language and legal certainty. And the hearing date was soon, too soon. Underneath the notice were other pages. Forms she hadn't filled out, signatures she hadn't written, check boxes she hadn't checked. The most frightening one wasn't the one that said guardianship. It was the one that used words like incapacity and recommendation, as if a stranger had already made a medical judgment about her mind. Marianne sat down hard in her kitchen chair and stared at the signature line again. It looked like her handwriting. Not close. Hers. The pressure, the slant, the little curl on the final letter. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she forced herself to do the only thing she could. She made a pile. Anything that didn't belong in her life went into that pile. Pill organizer, medication list, the new doormat tag, county papers. She took photos of everything with her phone, even if the phone camera was shaky, even if the letters blurred. Proof mattered more than perfection. Then she called the number on the notice again. This time the line rang once and a man answered. Calm, warm, almost kind. He said her name like he owned it. Marianne demanded to know why she was getting guardianship papers, why someone claimed she signed them. And the man chuckled softly, as if she'd asked an innocent question. He told her gently that everything was for her safety, that these reviews happened all the time, that she had agreed to support services. And when Marianne said she never agreed to anything, the man didn't argue. He simply said, "It's okay if you don't remember. It happens." Marianne felt her vision narrow. The same phrase, the same tactic. He offered to send Nora over to help explain. Marianne said no so sharply it surprised even her. And the man's tone didn't change, but the air in the room seemed to. He said, "Marianne, there's no need to make this hard." Then he added, in that same soft voice, "Also, please don't call emergency services again. It confuses the record." Marianne froze. The record. She asked him what he meant by that, and the man paused just long enough for her to feel the shape of a smile on the other end. "You had a hang-up call," he said. "That's all. That's what's in the system. And that's what will always be in the system." Marianne's hands shook so hard, she almost dropped the phone. She hung up without answering, her chest tight, her skin prickling as if someone had stepped into the room behind her. Then her doorbell rang. Not a gentle ring, a confident press, like whoever was outside expected her to open. Marianne didn't move. She stood in her kitchen listening. The bell rang again. Then she heard the sound of a key scraping metal in her front lock. Marianne's mouth went dry. She backed away, barefoot on tile, and grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, her cast iron skillet from the stove. Because fear makes you grab whatever turns you into someone harder to take. The lock clicked once, then twice. and her front door opened a fraction. Marianne held her breath so hard it hurt. A voice floated in, sweet and familiar. "Marianne? It's Nora. I brought your paperwork." Marianne didn't answer. She didn't step forward. She watched the door edge as it widened another inch, and she realized with sick clarity that Nora really did have a key. The door stopped, as if someone sensed the danger of pushing further. Nora's voice stayed gentle. "You don't have to be scared," she said. "I'm here to keep you safe." Marianne's grip tightened on the skillet. "Get out," she said, and her voice cracked because she hadn't spoken in hours. The hallway fell quiet. Then Nora sighed like a disappointed nurse. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll do it the official way." The door closed. The lock clicked again. Marianne stood trembling until her legs started to ache. Then she rushed to every lock in the house, turning them, checking them again, trying to convince herself that locked meant anything if someone else could open it. She pulled open a drawer and grabbed her husband's old notebook, the one he used to keep repair receipts in, and she wrote a single sentence in shaky handwriting. "Someone has a key." Then she underlined it 3 times, because paper was real. Paper didn't change when you looked away. The next day, Marianne went to a lawyer. Not a big downtown office, just a small place with a worn carpet and a receptionist who offered her water. The lawyer listened with the careful face professionals use when they're deciding whether to believe you. Marianne showed him the papers and the photos. She showed him the signature line. She told him about the 911 call that vanished. She told him about Nora and the key. The lawyer's expression hardened when he saw the notice date. He said guardianship abuse was real, that it happened more than people wanted to admit, and that once a petition was filed, it could move frighteningly fast. Marianne asked him how someone could fake her signature so perfectly. The lawyer didn't answer right away. He said the words Marianne feared most. "It depends." Then he added, "Sometimes they don't fake it. Sometimes they get the signature." Marianne felt her stomach drop. She tried to think of every paper she had signed recently, every clipboard, every receipt, every helpful form Nora had slid in front of her. She remembered the handyman visit, the medication list, the tablet. The calm voice saying, "It's okay if you don't remember." She remembered signing a package delivery slip a week ago while Nora stood on the porch smiling. Marianne whispered, "She tricked me." The lawyer nodded slightly, not surprised. He told her she needed a hearing defense, medical evaluation, bank records, property documents, anything that proved competence. He also told her the most important thing: do not be alone. Marianne almost laughed because she had been alone for 3 years. She promised anyway. She drove home in daylight, trying to believe the sun made her safe. In her driveway, she noticed a vehicle parked across the street that hadn't been there before, a plain sedan with dark windows. It didn't move when she looked at it. Marianne's heart beat faster. She went inside and locked the door, then checked the laundry window. The latch was fixed, tight, perfect, too perfect. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in her living room with every light on, the skillet on the coffee table like a ridiculous weapon. Her phone charged, the landline closed. At some point after midnight, the neighborhood went completely quiet. The TV show reruns ended. The house settled. And then, from somewhere deep in the walls, Marianne heard a soft click like a relay switch turning on. The porch light flickered once, twice, and on her kitchen table, where she had stacked the guardianship forms in a neat pile, there was now a new sheet of paper on top. Marianne stared at it from across the room, terrified to move closer. The paper was blank except for one typed line, centered like a message. "We can do this the easy way." Marianne's breath caught. She stood slowly, walked toward it, and when she was close enough to see the ink clearly, she noticed something else beneath the line. Tiny, almost hidden, like a secret code untamasind. A time. Not the wrong time from the police station. A new one. Marianne's hands began to shake uncontrollably. She didn't say it out loud. She couldn't, because in that moment she understood exactly what the whisper on the line meant. The time wasn't a detail. It was a trigger, a signature, a trap. And the house was waiting for her to speak it. Marianne stood over the kitchen table with the new sheet of paper in her fingers and refused to read the tiny code at the bottom, because the moment her eyes tried to form the numbers, her throat tightened like her body already knew what the trap wanted. And instead of speaking anything, she grabbed a thick black marker from the junk drawer and dragged it hard across the lower part of the page until the ink bled through and the paper wrinkled. Then she took a photo of it, then another. Then she folded it and shoved it into a zip bag like it was evidence from a crime scene. Because that's what it felt like now. Her life wasn't being threatened by a knife. It was being threatened by paperwork. She didn't sleep, not really. She sat in a chair facing the hallway with the skillet on her lap and her phone charging beside her, watching the dark like it might step forward and introduce itself. And when morning came, she called the lawyer again and told him someone had placed a new message on top of the forms and that it contained a time. And the lawyer went quiet for a second, like he was choosing between honesty and fear. And then he told her something that made her chest go cold. He told her these cases often depended on perception more than facts. That if they could paint her as unstable or paranoid, the court would protect her by taking control. And he warned her that calling the police too much could be used against her as confusion, which was exactly the kind of injustice that makes sane people feel like they're going insane. Marianne asked him what she should do when someone is literally walking into her house. And he said, very softly, that she needed a witness. Someone who could stand beside her and say, "I saw it too." Because in a system like this, reality only counts if another person signs off on it. Marianne had no family nearby, no husband, no adult children, just neighbors who waved politely and kept their curtains closed. But she forced herself to pick one anyway. The woman 2 houses down who always watered plants at the same hour. And she walked there in daylight, with the zip bag in her purse and her phone recording video in her pocket. And she knocked and introduced herself like she wasn't asking for help in the middle of a nightmare. The neighbor opened the door a crack, and Marianne saw the instant hesitation in her eyes. That reflex people have when an older person looks upset. The reflex that thinks, maybe she's confused. And Marianne knew she had seconds to win her. So she didn't tell the whole story. She told one clean fact. Last night, someone tried to enter her home with a key and then left a county guardianship notice on her table with her signature. And she said it like she was giving a weather report, not begging. The neighbor's eyes changed, because keys and signatures are not hallucinations. They are crimes. And she let Marianne in and told her to sit, and she listened. And when Marianne pulled out the zip-bagged paper with the markers smeared across the bottom, the neighbor didn't ask why it was blacked out. She just nodded like she understood the instinct to refuse a trap. The neighbor offered coffee, and Marianne's hands shook so hard she couldn't hold the cup. And that's when the neighbor said the sentence that made everything sharper. She said she had seen a woman in a blazer on Marianne's porch more than once. She said she'd seen a handyman. She said she'd seen a sedan parked across the street for hours. And Marianne felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made her cry, because for the first time the threat had edges. It wasn't just inside her head. That afternoon, the neighbor went with Marianne back to her house and stood on the porch with her while Marianne called the lawyer again. And the lawyer said he would file an emergency objection. But he warned Marianne something else was coming first. Because once a guardianship petition starts moving, the system doesn't wait politely for the target to understand it. It moves fast. It moves with authority. It moves with uniforms. The knock came just after dusk. 3 sharp raps that sounded official. And Marianne looked through the peephole and saw 2 police officers and a woman beside them with a folder pressed to her chest. And the woman's blazer was clean and her smile was perfectly measured. And even through the glass, Marianne recognized Nora. Marianne didn't open the door at first. She asked who they were, and one of the officers said they were there for a welfare check. And Nora's voice floated up from behind him, calm and sweet, saying she was just worried because Marianne had been distressed and there was a hearing approaching. And Marianne felt her stomach twist because the words were chosen to make the officers see her as a case, not a person. Marianne told them she was fine and that she had a lawyer. And Nora said she was glad to hear it and asked politely if they could come in for a quick assessment. And Marianne almost laughed because a quick assessment is how rights disappear, one polite step at a time. The neighbor stepped forward beside Marianne, clearly visible through the glass, and called out that Marianne was not alone and that she witnessed the paperwork and the key attempt. And the officer's posture shifted slightly, as if the presence of a second adult changed the math. Nora's smile didn't break, but her eyes sharpened, and she looked directly at Marianne and said, still sweetly, that refusing a welfare check could look concerning. And Marianne understood the real weapon now. Not force, not violence, but implication. The officers asked again to speak to Marianne in person, and Marianne made a decision she never thought she'd make in her own house. She opened the door, but she kept the chain on, and she spoke through the gap like she was negotiating with someone who already had paperwork in their pocket. Nora introduced herself again as if they'd never met. And when Marianne said she knew who she was and asked why she had a key, Nora's smile softened into something almost pitying. And she said she never had a key. She said Marianne must be confused. And she said it in front of the officers like she was planting a seed. Marianne felt heat rise behind her eyes, and she nearly snapped. But she remembered the lawyer's warning. She remembered perception, and she forced herself to stay quiet for one extra beat. Then she did the only thing that could cut through the performance. She lifted her phone and showed the officers the photos of the guardianship papers centered on her table, the signature line, the new message sheet, the blacked-out bottom. And the neighbor backed her up, and the officers leaned closer, their faces turning serious in that way that says they recognize an actual problem but don't yet know which authority owns it. Nora stepped closer to the chain, still smiling, and told the officers she could provide documentation. And Marianne felt the air shift, as if the house itself was holding its breath. One of the officers asked Nora directly if she was a court-appointed guardian, and Nora said not yet. She said the hearing was upcoming. She said the court would decide what was best, and she said it like the outcome was already written. The officers told Marianne they weren't there to enforce guardianship. They were there to ensure she was safe. And Marianne wanted to scream that safety is not the same as freedom. But she swallowed it and asked them to take a report about attempted unlawful entry and forged signatures. The older officer hesitated and said this sounded like a civil matter tied to the court process. And Marianne felt the injustice hit her like a physical shove. Because someone could rewrite her life with paperwork, and the police were telling her it wasn't their lane. Then the younger officer looked at the chain, looked at Nora, and asked quietly if there had been other calls. Nora answered before Marianne could. She said there had been a late-night hang-up, and she said it with the confidence of someone reading from a screen. And Marianne's blood went cold because that was the lie the system had written. Marianne shook her head hard and said there had been a full 911 call. She described it. She described the whisper. She described the moment it dropped, and the older officer's face tightened like he was deciding whether to believe her. And Nora's smile widened just enough to feel cruel. And she said, "It's okay if you don't remember the details, Marianne. It happens." The neighbor flinched, because hearing that phrase out loud made it sound like what it really was, a script. Marianne felt her knees weaken, but she held herself upright, and she asked the officers to check the dispatch records again. And the younger officer said he could call it in, and he stepped away to his radio, and Nora's eyes followed him like a hawk. The radio crackled, and the officer spoke low. Then he returned with a look Marianne didn't like. The look people have when a machine tells them something and they don't know how to argue with it. He said dispatch showed only a hang-up and no report. And Marianne felt her throat close because it wasn't only that the record was wrong, it was that it was wrong with authority. She turned to Nora and said, very softly, that she had blacked out the time because she wasn't going to give them the trigger. And Nora's smile finally faltered for a fraction of a second, like Marianne had spoken a language she didn't expect her to know. The older officer told Nora to step back and told Marianne he couldn't arrest anyone without clear evidence of a crime. But he advised her to stay with a friend or neighbor and to contact her attorney immediately. And he said it kindly, which almost made it worse, because kindness doesn't fix a system that can erase a call. Nora nodded politely, thanked the officers like this was all routine, and then she looked at Marianne through the chain gap and said, in a voice only Marianne and the neighbor could really hear, that the hearing would be easier if Marianne stopped resisting. And she said that the court didn't like drama. And then she turned and walked down the steps with her folder hugged tight like a prize. The officers left. The porch light clicked on automatically, and Marianne realized her hands were shaking so hard she couldn't close the door for a second. The neighbor helped her, and inside the house, Marianne sat at her kitchen table staring at the pile of papers like it was a stack of weapons. She wanted to call 911 again, but she didn't trust what would happen to her words. She wanted to shout the truth, but she could already see how shouting would be labeled. She wanted a witness, but witnesses can be intimidated. And that's when the neighbors said she had a cousin who used to work in dispatch years ago, that she could ask for advice. And Marianne felt something like hope for the first time, because hope in stories like this is never a warm feeling. It's a tool. The neighbor made the call on speaker, and a woman answered with a tired voice. And when the neighbor explained what was happening, the woman didn't laugh. She didn't doubt. She didn't say it sounded impossible. She just said, very flatly, that if Marianne's call disappeared, then someone had access to logs. and she said Marianne needed an old-fashioned trail, paper, photos, and something the system couldn't rewrite after the fact. And she suggested a small analog voice recorder, the kind journalists used, because a physical recording doesn't care what a database says. Marianne stared at the landline handset on her table and realized how insane it was that she was about to start living like she was in a spy movie just to keep her own name. But injustice makes ordinary people learn extraordinary behaviors fast. That night, Marianne didn't stay alone. The neighbor insisted she sleep on her couch, and Marianne agreed, even though leaving her house felt like surrender. And before she left, she walked through every room with her phone camera on, panning slow, documenting the placement of objects, the lock positions, the laundry window latch, the table, the paper stack, everything. Because if something moved while she was gone, she wanted proof that it wasn't her mind. She turned off the lights, stood in the doorway for a long moment, and felt her home look back at her like it was no longer hers. In the neighbor's house, Marianne lay awake on the couch, listening to unfamiliar creaks, and she thought about the whisper that said, "Don't say her name." And she thought about Nora saying, "It's okay if you don't remember." And she thought about the hang-up record stamped into the system like a verdict. And she realized the attack wasn't only legal, it was psychological. It was designed to make her question herself until she surrendered for peace. Sometime after midnight, the neighbor's phone vibrated with a call from an unknown number. And Marianne watched the screen glow from across the room, and neither of them answered, and the phone stopped, and then it rang again, and the neighbor frowned and silenced it. And Marianne's heart began to pound because she recognized the rhythm of persistence, the way a system keeps knocking until you open something. The neighbor finally turned the phone face down, and the room went quiet again. And for a moment, Marianne almost believed they were safe, until the neighbor's smart speaker in the corner, something Marianne didn't even own, lit up by itself. And in a voice that wasn't quite a person and wasn't quite a machine, it whispered a single phrase into the dark. "Say it." Marianne's blood turned to ice and she shot upright because she knew exactly what it meant. And she knew this wasn't only happening in her house anymore. And then the neighbor's front door lock clicked once, very softly, like a key testing metal. And Marianne realized the next stage of the trap had begun. If they couldn't control the record from inside her home, they would follow her into someone else's. Marianne didn't wait to find out if the lock would fully turn. She stood up so fast the blanket slid off her shoulders, and she grabbed her purse and the zip-bagged paper like they were life preservers. And the neighbor's eyes were wide in the dim light as she reached for her own phone with shaking fingers. But Marianne didn't want another call to become another hang-up. So she forced herself to think like the dispatcher cousin had suggested. Paper, photos, physical proof. And she whispered to the neighbor that they needed a witness who couldn't be politely talked out of reality. And the neighbor said her cousin could meet them at the station, that she could bring an old analog recorder too. And Marianne nodded like a soldier taking orders. They moved quietly, not running, because running makes you look guilty in the eyes of anyone watching from a car across the street. And Marianne had learned this wasn't only about fear, it was about how fear could be interpreted on paper. The lock at the neighbor's front door clicked again, softer this time, like a key testing boundaries. And then it stopped, as if whoever was outside realized they wouldn't get the satisfaction of watching Marianne panic. They didn't open the door, and that choice felt like a message in itself. We can wait. The neighbor insisted on turning on every light, and Marianne let her, even though bright light didn't erase the feeling of being watched. It only made the shadows sharper. They sat at the kitchen table together, and Marianne took out the county notice again. And she showed the neighbor every form, every signature line, every tiny checkbox that turned a life into a case file. And the neighbor's face hardened with anger because injustice is easier to see when it isn't happening to you. The neighbor said she would testify that she saw Nora on the porch and that she saw the sedan across the street. And Marianne felt a strange mixture of gratitude and shame because she hated that she needed another adult to validate her basic truth. Just before dawn, the neighbor's cousin arrived, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a calm voice. And she brought exactly what Marianne needed. An old digital recorder with physical buttons and a small notebook. She listened to Marianne's story without the skeptical smile Marianne had started to expect from professionals. And when Marianne mentioned the vanished 911 call and the wrong timestamp, the cousin didn't laugh. She said she had seen strange routing issues before. She said sometimes system maintenance could mask mistakes. But she also said the pattern sounded too clean, like someone wanted the database to tell a specific story. She told Marianne the first rule was to stop relying on the system to validate anything. And the second rule was to force the system to confront physical reality. Then she gave Marianne a plan. She said they would go back to Marianne's house in daylight, with the neighbor and herself as witnesses. They would film everything the moment they entered, and they would set a simple trap that wasn't violent and wasn't illegal. They would document the lock positions, the window latch, the placement of objects, and they would place a single strip of clear tape across the laundry room door seam, the kind that would tear if the door opened. And they would photograph it from multiple angles. If someone came in with a key, the tape would break. And if the tape broke, Marianne wouldn't need anyone to believe her memory. She would have a physical fact. Marianne agreed, and the three of them drove in a tight, quiet convoy back to her street as the sun rose, and Marianne's stomach twisted when she saw the sedan still parked across the road, because it hadn't moved all night. It was just sitting there like a patient animal. The cousin took photos of the sedan with her phone from a distance, capturing the license plate area, even if it was slightly blurred, because she said imperfect proof was still proof if it showed a pattern. They walked up to Marianne's porch together, and Marianne noticed something else that made her blood run cold. The new doormat had changed again, a different pattern, as if someone was cycling objects to test whether she noticed. The cousin photographed the mat too. Inside the house, daylight made the rooms look harmless, and that was almost insulting, because the threat wasn't about broken glass or smashed furniture. It was about control that left the world looking normal. Marianne filmed every lock, every hinge, every drawer, every paper stack, and the cousin narrated quietly into the recorder what they were doing. So there would be an audio timeline that didn't depend on a database. They checked the laundry room window latch, still perfect, still newly fixed. And the cousin pointed out the screw heads, looked recently turned. Marianne's hands shook as she placed the clear tape strip across the laundry room door seam. And then they all stood back and photographed it. 3 angles, close and wide, because courts love angles. Then the cousin did something Marianne hadn't expected. She called the county number on the guardianship notice from her own phone and put it on speaker while Marianne recorded the call with the analog device. So even if the call log was changed later, the sound would exist in plastic and memory. The same calm man answered. He said Marianne's name like he was greeting a client. The cousin stayed polite and asked for clarification on the petition and the hearing date. The man explained everything smoothly, and then, without being prompted, he referenced the hang-up incident again, the way someone references a fact they think is settled. The cousin's eyes flicked to Marianne, and Marianne felt a surge of nausea because that phrase was proof of collusion. He didn't just know the system's lie, he was repeating it as leverage. The cousin asked him why the time in the record didn't match, and there was a pause on the line that felt like someone stepping into a darker room. The man's tone remained warm, but it sharpened, and he said he couldn't discuss system details. And then he said, almost casually, that resistance would only make the process harder, and he suggested Marianne accept services for her own comfort. The cousin thanked him politely and ended the call. Then she looked at Marianne and said, quietly, that the man spoke like he had access to dispatch notes or like someone was feeding him information. And she said it didn't prove a hack yet, but it proved something was coordinated. They left the house after setting the tape and went to sit in the neighbor's living room, where they could watch Marianne's porch from a side window without being obvious. For 2 hours, nothing happened. Then, just after noon, a clean car pulled up to Marianne's curb, and Nora stepped out with the same folder hugged to her chest. And this time she wasn't alone. A man got out of the passenger side, mid-40s, neat hair, calm face, and he walked with the quiet confidence of someone who thinks paperwork is armor. Nora didn't knock. She used a key. Marianne's breath caught, and her hands clenched so hard her nails bit her palms. The cousin hit record on the analog device immediately. Through binoculars, they watched Nora and the man step inside. They stayed for less than 2 minutes. Then they left, got back into the car, and drove away like they had checked a box. Marianne wanted to run to her house immediately, but the cousin told her to wait 10 minutes so it wouldn't look like they were lying in wait. Because again, perception was part of the weapon. Those 10 minutes felt longer than the whole night. When they finally went back, Marianne's heart hammered as she opened her front door and rushed to the laundry room. The tape strip across the door seam was torn cleanly in the center, not peeled. Torn. A physical fact. Marianne stared at it and felt tears blur her vision. Not because she was afraid, but because she was furious. Furious that she had to set traps in her own home just to prove she wasn't crazy. The cousin photographed the torn tape. Then she photographed it with a ruler next to it. And she dictated into the recorder the exact time they discovered it, without saying it out loud for Marianne's sake. She just said midday and after the visitors, because she didn't want to feed the trigger if the trigger was real. Then they went to the kitchen table, and Marianne found what she expected and still wasn't ready for. A new document on top of the pile, a fresh page, crisp and official. It was a consent to evaluation form, already filled in with Marianne's name, already dated, already prepared for a signature. The signature line was blank. It was waiting. And beside it, neatly placed like a gift, was Marianne's pen. Marianne's hands shook. The cousin didn't touch the paper. She photographed it. And she said they were done playing defense, that now they would go on offense. She told Marianne they would take the torn tape photos, the witness statements, the analog call recording, and the footage of Nora entering with a key to an attorney and to a judge. And they would request an emergency restraining order and a fraud investigation. And she said even if the guardianship hearing was already scheduled, judges did not like key-based entries and pre-filled consent forms. They drove straight to the lawyer's office with the evidence in a folder and the analog recorder in Marianne's lap like a sacred object. And when the lawyer saw the torn tape photos and heard the recorded phone call, his face changed from careful professionalism to something closer to anger. He said this was no longer a vague concern, It was a pattern of coercion and possible identity abuse. And he said he could file an emergency motion that day. The neighbor signed a statement. The cousin signed a statement. Marianne signed a statement with a steady hand, not because she wasn't scared, but because she refused to be rewritten. The lawyer also did one more thing. He sent a formal notice to the county that all contact with Marianne must go through counsel. And he demanded the identity of the petitioner and the evaluator. 2 hours later, Marianne received a call on her cell from an unknown number. She didn't answer. It rang again. She didn't answer. Then her landline at home rang, even though no one was home. The cousin, still at Marianne's house collecting more photos, recorded the landline ringing on video to show the persistence. And later that evening, the lawyer called Marianne with a voice that sounded like someone had finally slammed a door on a bully. He said the judge granted a temporary protective order. He said the court ordered the petition paused pending a fraud review. And he said the county would open an investigation looked into the service and the individuals involved. Marianne sat in the lawyer's office and cried for the first time in days. Not silently, not politely, but like someone who had been holding their breath underwater and finally surfaced. She thought that would be the end. She thought a court order would make the world behave. But when she returned home that night with the neighbor and the cousin, the house felt too quiet again, as if it was listening. The torn tape had been replaced with a fresh strip, perfectly aligned, like someone had tried to undo the evidence. On the kitchen table, on top of the papers, was one last sheet of blank paper with a single typed line in the center. No signature, no stamp, just a message that felt like a whisper from the walls. "We heard you." Marianne's blood ran cold. The cousin stared at it for a long time and then said something that landed like a final truth. Even if they stopped the guardianship scam, someone had been inside Marianne's home, and someone had manipulated a 911 record. And that meant this wasn't just a civil fraud case. It was a system vulnerability. And someone out there had learned how to make reality negotiable. Marianne looked at the paper, looked at the locks, and realized she hadn't won peace. She had won time. And time, she now understood, was exactly what the trap had wanted her to say. Subscribe to the channel. There will be new stories every day.